The final chord of Tosca still trembled in the gilded rafters of Teatro alla Scala when the screaming began. Backstage, beneath the ghost light, the greatest soprano of her generation lay on the floor of her dressing room, eyes wide in eternal surprise. A crimson silk scarf, her own, knotted so tightly about her throat that the embroidered golden bees of Napoleon had left their mark upon her skin. Isabella Valenti was dead, and Hercule Poirot, who had come only to hear her sing, found himself drawn once more into the darkest duet of all. Murder. Chapter 1. The voice that stopped forever. The final note of Vici d'arte still hung in the velvet darkness of La Scala like a suspended star when the screaming began, raw animal, tearing through the polite thunder of applause as though someone had ripped the silk lining from the night itself. Hercule Poirot, seated in the third row of the royal box, felt the sound strike him in the sternum with the precision of a stiletto. He had come to Milan only for the voice, nothing more. He had promised himself a single evening without corpses, without the eternal dance of motive and opportunity. Yet even as 10,000 gloved hands beat together in frantic ovation, he knew, with the dull certainty of a man who has heard that particular scream too many times, that death had accepted his invitation and taken the empty chair beside him. He rose at once. The little Belgian moved with the neat economy that characterized all his actions, excusing himself past knees and perfumed programs. His patent leather shoes whispering over the crimson carpet of the corridor that led behind the stage. The applause continued, wave upon wave, but it was already changing timbre, becoming uneasy, threaded with confusion, for the diva had not returned for her fourth curtain call and the stage door stood ajar, spilling a wedge of hard white working light into the gilded gloom. A stagehand, face the color of old parchment, stumbled out and vomited neatly into a sand bucket. Poirot stepped around him without breaking stride. The corridor narrowed, smelling of resin, sweat, and the particular metallic sweetness of terror. Doors flew open on either side. Seamstresses, choristers, a tenor still in his Cavaradossi blood-stained tunic, all speaking at once in frantic Milanese. Poirot caught only fragments, morta, impossibile, la sciarpa, but they were enough. At the end, beneath a single bulb painted ecclesiastical red, stood Capitano De Luca of the Questura, his uniform cap crushed in one fist, his black mustache bristling like an offended cat. 2 carabinieri barred the way with crossed rifles, faces pale beneath their helmets. De Luca saw Poirot and threw up both hands in theatrical despair. "Signor Poirot, per l'amor di Dio, you are the last person Milan needs tonight." "And yet," Poirot replied mildly, adjusting the angle of his bowler with one gloved finger, "here I find myself. Permit me, Capitano. A lady has suffered an indignity. It is not courteous to leave her waiting." De Luca swore under his breath but stood aside, for even in Italy the name Hercule Poirot carried its own passport. Poirot stepped past him into the star dressing room and closed the door with a soft click that somehow silenced every voice in the corridor. The room was a small gilded cage, walls lined with pale blue silk damask, a chaise longue upholstered in ivory velvet now bearing the unmistakable imprint of tragedy. Mirrors on 3 sides multiplied the scene into infinity. Isabella Valenti lay on her back amid a snowdrift of discarded costume petals, arms flung wide as though she had tried to embrace the air one final time. Her famous throat that had held the world in thrall, was encircled by her own stage scarf, crimson silk heavy with embroidered golden bees, the emblem of Napoleon that she had worn as Floria Tosca. The scarf had been knotted once, then pulled so savagely that the delicate embroidery had bitten deep into the flesh, leaving a necklace of tiny golden wounds. Her eyes, those great dark eyes that could melt an audience at 50 paces, stared upward at the painted ceiling where cherubs cavorted in powdered wigs. One earring, a magnificent pearl shaped like a tear, had been torn away. It lay on the carpet like a fallen moon. Yet it was not the horror alone that arrested Poirot. It was the silence. The woman who had filled the greatest opera house in Europe with a voice of molten silver now made no sound at all, and the absence was louder than any scream. He moved closer, careful not to disturb the chaos. A crystal flute of champagne stood on the dressing table, half full, its bubbles long since surrendered. Lipstick, her trademark shade, sangue di Tosca, had left a perfect crescent on the rim. Beside it, another glass, untouched. A bouquet of white camellias, still dewed from the florist's refrigerator, had been hurled to the floor. One bloom lay crushed beneath her shoulder like a communion wafer. On the open score of Tosca, turned to the very aria she had just sung, someone had scrawled in a hurried feminine hand across the margin of Vici d'arte, vici d'amore, the words, "I lived for art, I lived for love, I shall die for both." Poirot bent low. The camellia beneath her body was not merely crushed. Its stem had been snapped cleanly, deliberately, as though someone had used it to mark a place in a book of death. He straightened, twirled one point of his luxuriant mustache, and allowed his gaze to travel the room with the precision of a watchmaker. The door to the private lavatory stood ajar. Inside, the mirror was still misty from recent steam. A towel lay discarded on the marble floor. Someone had washed their hands with haste. On the chaise longue, a small mother-of-pearl button, clearly torn from a man's dress shirt, glinted among the folds of a discarded cape. And on the carpet, almost invisible against the intricate pattern of aubergines and gold, a single smear of stage rosin, still tacky, leading toward the door that opened onto the backstage corridor. Poirot knelt, touched the rosin with a gloved fingertip, and brought it to his nose. The sharp scent of violinists and ballerinas, but beneath it something else. Bay rum, the pomade favored by only one man in the entire company. He stood very still. The little gray cells, as he liked to call them, began to stir like cats waking from a nap. Outside, the applause had finally died, replaced by a restless murmuring that swelled and broke like surf. Somewhere a woman was sobbing in great tearing gulps. Poirot turned back to the body. With infinite gentleness, he reached out and closed those magnificent eyes, murmuring in French too low for any listener, "Pauvre petite, you sang your last aria more beautifully than you knew." Then, straightening his cuffs, he addressed the empty room in his precise, faintly accented Italian. "Eh bien, the curtain has fallen, but the drama she is not yet finished. 5 people possessed keys to this room during the final act. One of them returned after the applause began. One of them closed that door." He indicated the heavy portal behind him, and turned the key from the outside that the discovery might be delayed. One of them believed that 10,000 witnesses in the auditorium would provide the perfect alibi. But they reckoned without Hercule Poirot. He moved to the door, opened it, and found Capitano De Luca still hovering like a nervous moth. "You will seal this room," Poirot instructed. "You will permit no one to enter until I have completed my examination, and you will assemble every soul who was within 20 meters of this corridor between the end of the aria and the discovery of the body. We have, I think, perhaps 10 minutes before the newspapers arrive like vultures. Let us not waste them." De Luca opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally managed a strangled, "Subito, signore." Poirot allowed himself the very smallest of smiles. Then, as he turned back into the dressing room, he noticed something that made even his disciplined pulse quicken. On the inside of the door, at the height of a child might reach, 4 faint parallel scratches marred the paint, as though fingernails had clawed for purchase that was not there. Someone, Isabella herself almost certainly, had tried to escape in those final seconds. She had not died willingly. Whatever oath she had once sworn upon art and love, it had not included no clause surrendering her life to a murderer's hands. Poirot removed his hat, placed it carefully on the chaise longue beside the ruined camellias, and rolled up his sleeves with the air of a man preparing for a long and meticulous night. "Très bien," he whispered to the silent room and its silent occupant. "Now, we begin." Chapter 2. The five who watched her die. Poirot stood alone, beneath the great chandelier of the empty auditorium, its thousand crystals dimmed to mourning, while the last echoes of the audience's departure seeped away like blood from a fresh wound. Then he turned on his heel and walked backstage again, past the stacked flats of a painted Rome that would never now see its Tosca again, until he reached the narrow green room where Capitano De Luca had herded the five souls who had held between them every key to Isabella Valenti's dressing room during the third act. They sat beneath a merciless bulb as though posed for a police photographer. Conte Riccardo della Torre in faultless evening dress, yet with his white tie askew and his aristocratic face the color of wet ash. Maestro Arturo Bellincioni still clutching his ivory baton as if it were the only solid thing left in a dissolving world. Lucia Moretti, the understudy, wrapped in a man's camel hair coat 2 sizes too large for her, eyes swollen but burning. Johnny Rossi, the dresser, twisting a lock of brilliantined hair round and round his finger until the skin went purple. And slightly apart, the stage manager, Signor Cassati, a gray, anonymous man who had seen everything and remembered more. Poirot surveyed them with the bright, bird-like tilt of the head that always made the guilty feel suddenly transparent. He began without preamble, his voice soft yet carrying to the furthest corner as though the very walls of La Scala leaned in to listen. 5 persons possessed the means to enter the star dressing room between the moment Madame Valenti left the stage at the end of Vici d'Arte and the moment her body was discovered at 7 minutes past 11. 5 persons had reason, some more visible than others, to wish her silent forever. We shall examine these reasons with the clarity of a diamond cutter, for only when motive is laid bare does opportunity reveal its true shape. He moved first to Conte Riccardo, who attempted a smile that cracked like old porcelain. The Della Torre fortune, Poirot remarked almost conversationally, had dwindled to a single villa mortgaged to the roof and a cellar of empty bottles bearing illustrious labels. Only Isabella's promise of marriage and the substantial settlement she intended to make upon her husband stood between the Conte and the disgrace of bankruptcy. Riccardo had been seen in the corridor at 20 minutes to 11 carrying a bouquet of white camellias tied with gold ribbon. The same camellias now lay crushed beneath the dead woman's shoulder. A lover's gift, the Conte protested hoarsely. Nothing more. Poirot merely raised an eyebrow and passed on. Maestro Bellincioni required no prompting. The words burst from him like an overture played fortissimo. For 15 years he had shaped Isabella's voice, her career, her soul. For 10 of those years he had shared her bed, believing that the fire between them would never cool. Tonight, hours before curtain, she had told him calmly that after this final Tosca she would leave the stage forever, leave Milan, leave him, to become a contessa in a crumbling palazzo. Witnesses in the orchestra pit had heard him hiss, "If I cannot have you, no one shall," with such venom that the first violin had missed his entry. Bellincioni's hands, still holding the baton, trembled now. Poirot noticed that the middle finger bore a fresh burn as though it had brushed something hotter than passion. Lucia Moretti lifted her chin with the defiance of a younger lioness. For 3 seasons she had warmed the bench while Isabella collected the roses. Tonight she had stood in the wings throughout the act, 50 choristers ready to swear she never moved. Yet the hem of her gown was stained with crushed camellia petals, and her left glove carried a faint smear of sangue di Tosca lipstick that could only have come from the star's own dressing table. "I worshipped her," Lucia whispered, but the word came out edged, like a stiletto sliding from its sheath. Gianni Rossi tried to smirk and failed. In his pocket, the police had already discovered a small notebook filled with dates, sums, and the initials IV. In his lodgings they would find, Poirot knew, a packet of letters forged in Isabella's hand describing liaisons with a certain married prince. Gianni had demanded 50,000 lire for silence. Isabella had laughed in his face at 9:30 that evening, telling him to take her emerald necklace instead and choke on it. The necklace was now missing. Gianni's alibi was that he had been pressing costumes in the quick-change booth, yet his shoes carried traces of the same rosin found in the dressing room, and his cuffs were flecked with gold thread from the Napoleonic bees. Finally, Poirot turned to the silent stage manager Casati, who had spent the fatal minutes at his post by the prompt corner, cueing lights and curtains with mechanical precision. His logbook showed that at 10:47 p.m., while the audience was still roaring its ovation, he had signaled the follow spot to dim, then immediately bright again, a hesitation of no more than 8 seconds. 8 seconds, Poirot mused aloud, was long enough for a determined man to slip through the pass door, cross the corridor unseen, and return before the next cue. Casati's face remained a mask, but his Adam's apple bobbed once, betraying him. Poirot stepped back, spreading his hands like a conjurer who has arranged his props. 5 motives, each sharp enough to cut silk. 5 opportunities, each narrow as a coffin lid. But only one pair of hands tightened that scarf while 10,000 people applauded 3 floors above. The little gray cells, they are already beginning to sing in harmony. Tomorrow we shall give them the full score. As he turned to leave, Lucia Moretti's handbag, left carelessly on a chair, tipped sideways, and from its glittering mouth spilled a river of green fire. The missing emerald necklace, catching the cruel light like a scream frozen into jewels. 5 pairs of eyes followed it, and in that instant Poirot saw guilt, terror, and calculation flicker across every face. He permitted himself the very smallest of smiles, picked up his hat, and walked out into the corridor where the ghost light still burned, waiting for a diva who would never again take her bow. Chapter 3. The Poisoned. Champagne Poirot returned to the dressing room at 1:30 in the morning, when the theater had finally surrendered to silence and even the rats had ceased their nocturnal ballet behind the wainscot. Only the ghost light remained, a single bulb on an iron stand placed center stage by ancient tradition, so the spirits of old performers would not stumble in the dark, and its pale glow leaked under the door like a guilty secret. He carried a small leather case in the calm authority of a man who has sent every policeman away with polite but immovable instructions. The room had not been touched. Isabella Valenti still lay in her silent crucifixion of crimson and ivory, the scarf about her throat now stiff with the first rigors of death. Yet even in that rigidity she retained the posture of performance, one arm flung out as though she were about to rise for one final impossible high C. Poirot set the case upon the chaise longue, opened it with a click that sounded indecently loud, and drew out a pair of fine kid gloves thinner than gossamer, and a small electric torch whose beam was narrow as a rapier. Then, moving with the reverence of a priest at an altar, he began his solitary mass for the dead. First he knelt beside the 2 crystal flutes on the dressing table, one half empty, its rim bearing the perfect crescent of Isabella's lipstick, the other untouched, its surface still beaded with condensation as though it had only just been poured. Between them stood the bottle, Veuve Clicquot, 1928, the foil cap crumpled, the cork lying beside it like a spent cartridge. A gift card, Expensive cream stock lay face down. When Poirot turned it over, the single initial R stared up at him in confident black ink. He lifted the half-drained glass to his nose. Beneath the festive scent of champagne lay something acrid, metallic, unmistakable. Cyanide of potassium, enough to kill a regiment of sopranos. Yet Isabella had died by strangulation. The poison had never reached her lips after that single sip, if indeed she had taken it at all. Poirot's mustache twitched with satisfaction. Here was the first discord in the murderer's score. He decanted a droplet onto a strip of test paper from his case. It turned the color of fresh blood within seconds. Enough, certainly, to fell an elephant, let alone a woman whose throat was already destined for silk. Next he examined the untouched glass. The liquid inside was innocent, no trace of bitterness, no chemical ghost. Someone had intended a double death, or a spectacular false trail. The bottle itself yielded more. The cork had been drawn with a waiter's friend, not the theatrical saber some tenors affected, and the foil bore the faintest indentation of a thumb wearing a heavy signet ring, the della Torre crest unmistakable even in negative. Poirot allowed himself a soft ah of confirmation. Conte Riccardo had indeed sent champagne, but not this champagne. The real gift, he would later swear, had been a modest Asti carried by his own footman and left at the stage door at 8 o'clock. This richer vintage had been substituted en route, the card-deft palming of one bottle for another performed in the chaos of flowers and telegrams that always besieged a star on a triumphant night. Poirot's torch beam crawled across the carpet like a luminous insect. It found the faint trail of Rosen again, more distinct now, leading from the dressing table toward the conductor's door that opened onto the backstage corridor, a door used only by Bellincioni and his concertmaster. The grains glittered pale amber, still slightly tacky. Someone wearing orchestra shoes had stood here long enough for the Rosen to transfer. And on the lower panel of that same door, almost invisible unless one searched for, a single smear of sangue di Tosca lipstick at the height of a man's mouth, as though someone had paused to kiss the wood in farewell or in promise. He turned back to the body. With infinite care, he loosened the scarf just enough to see the livid furrow beneath. The knot was a simple slip knot, the kind used to fasten a cape, pulled from behind with the steady strength of hands accustomed to wielding a baton for 4 hours at a stretch. There were no hesitation marks, no defensive wounds on the arms. Isabella had not struggled long. Perhaps she had trusted her killer until the final second. Perhaps the first sip of champagne had already begun its work, dulling resistance. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The timing was exquisite, almost artistic. The murderer had entered while the audience was still roaring, had waited until the diva turned to the mirror to remove her stage makeup, had offered the toast to your greatest triumph, and then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, drawn the scarf tight while 10,000 people unknowingly applauded the overture to her death. A soft sound at the door made him pivot, torch raised like a weapon. Lucia Moretti stood there, wrapped in the same oversized camel hair coat, her face stripped of its earlier defiance and now the color of candle wax. In her trembling hand she held the missing pearl earring, the one torn from Isabella's ear in the final convulsion. I found it in my dressing room," she whispered. "Under my chair. I swear I don't know how it got there." Poirot took the jewel delicately between gloved fingers. On the gold post clung a single strand of dark hair, unmistakably Isabella's, and a microscopic flake of dried blood. Someone had planted it, clumsily, obviously, within the last hour. The little Belgian's eyes glittered with something that might have been anger or pity. "Return to your room, mademoiselle," he said gently. "Lock the door and touch nothing more. The hunter is growing nervous. Nervous hunters miss their aim." Lucia fled, coat flapping like broken wings. Poirot waited until her footsteps died, then knelt once more beside the body. From his waistcoat pocket he produced a single white camellia, perfect, uncrushed, and laid it upon Isabella's breast where her heart had so recently beaten for art and for love. "Pardon, madam," he murmured. "One more indignity, then I promise you justice." He rose, snapped off the torch, and stood in the near darkness listening to the theater breathe around him. Somewhere high in the flies a rope creaked. Somewhere in the orchestra pit a dropped music stand shifted with a ghostly clang. La Scala was never truly empty, he reflected. It was filled with the ghosts of every note ever sung beneath its roof, and tonight they were all listening. Poirot addressed them softly in French. "You heard her final aria. Now you will hear mine." Then, carrying the poisoned glass wrapped in a silk handkerchief, he walked out, closing the door with the same soft click that had sealed Isabella's fate, and the ghost light burned on alone, waiting for a soprano who would never again answer its call. Chapter 4. The Score That Lied. At 4 o'clock in the morning, when the Milanese sky had turned the color of tarnished silver and the first tram of the day clanged somewhere far beyond the piazza, Poirot sat alone at the prompt desk in the orchestra pit, the vast auditorium yawning empty above him like a black water, and opened the blood-spattered score of Tosca that had lain beneath Isabella Valenti's lifeless hand. The pages were heavy vellum, the margins crowded with her annotations in violet ink breath marks, crescendos, tiny hearts beside phrases she loved. Yet one annotation stood apart. Across the soaring phrase, "Vici d'arte, vici d'amore," someone had written in hurried pencil, almost invisible against the staves, "Tonight I keep my oath. Forgive me. I." The handwriting slanted sharply left, the letters cramped and trembling, the final period pressed so hard it had torn the paper. A suicide note, the police surgeon had declared, and half of Milan already believed the diva had strangled herself in a fit of artistic despair. Poirot, however, believed nothing until the little gray cells had sung every note in unison. He laid the score beneath the green-shaded lamp the prompter used during performances and took from his pocket a small magnifying lens no larger than a monocle. The pencil lead was soft, 2B, the sort used by conductors for last-minute markings. The pressure varied, heavy at the beginning of each word, lighter at the end, the unmistakable signature of a left-handed writer. Isabella Valenti had been fiercely right-handed. He had watched her sign programs earlier that week with a flourish that began at the right margin and swept leftward like a comet. Someone else had written this confession, someone who knew that the score would be found beneath her body and seized upon by eager journalists as proof of tragic despair. Poirot turned to the final page of the act. It had been torn out with violence. Only a ragged quarter remained, clinging by a thread of paper fiber. He held it to the light. On the fragment, in the same violet ink Isabella used for her genuine notes, were the words, "Kill the diva in me." And beneath them, almost obliterated by the tear, the ghost of a single golden bee transferred from the embroidered scarf when the page was pressed against it in death. The missing page had contained the stage direction for Tosca's suicide leap from the Castel Sant'Angelo, an irony too cruel to be accidental. Whoever removed it had wanted the world to believe Isabella had chosen her own ending. Yet they had left this accusing corner behind, either through haste or arrogance. He closed the score and placed it carefully aside, then drew from his case a small envelope containing the speck of baton varnish he had lifted from the forged margin earlier that night. Under the lamp it gleamed the exact deep amber of the varnish Maestro Bellincioni used on his favorite ivory baton, a formula he mixed himself with Venetian turpentine and a secret proportion of dragon's blood resin. Poirot had watched him apply it only yesterday afternoon, humming under his breath as he stroked the stick like a lover. A single droplet no larger than a pinhead had transferred from baton to page when the forgery was written, an oversight, perhaps, or the unconscious vanity of an artist signing his work in a medium only another artist would recognize. The little Belgian rose and walked the deserted stage, his footsteps ringing on the boards where Isabella had died only hours before. He paused at the conductor's podium, still littered with Bellincione's marked scores, and lifted the baton that lay across the Kyrie of the third act. The varnish was freshly touched up. A minute void, no wider than a fingernail, showed where the droplet had been lost. Poirot twirled the baton once, feeling its perfect balance, then laid it down exactly as he had found it. He knew now whose hand had written the false confession, but he needed the man to betray himself in full voice. He returned to the wings and summoned the night watchman, a grizzled Sicilian named Benedetto who had guarded La Scala for 40 years and claimed to know every creak of its bones. "Tell me, amico," Poirot asked softly, "did anyone visit the conductor's room after the performance?" Benedetto scratched his stubbled chin. "Only the maestro himself, signore. Came down from the stage about midnight, white as death, carrying the Tosca score under his arm. Went into his room, shut the door. 10 minutes later, he came out without the score. Went to the fireplace in the green room and burned something. I thought it was old letters. He was crying, signore. Grown man crying like a child." Poirot thanked him and walked alone to the green room. The fire had been allowed to die, but the ashes were still warm. With a silver fruit knife, he teased apart the gray flakes until he found what he sought. A corner of heavy vellum, the last remnant of the missing page, bearing in Bellincione's own bold hand the single damning line, "She must die as Tosca dies." The rest had become ash, but this fragment had escaped the flames, curling like a guilty tongue. Poirot slipped it into an envelope, then stood listening to the theater breathe around him, the faint groan of ropes settling, the distant drip of a leaky tap, the perpetual whisper of 10,000 performances that refused to die. He pictured Bellincione at the fireplace only hours ago, feeding the page to the flames while tears ran down the face that had once been handsome in a lifetime of passion. The oath of the title had not been Isabella's alone. 20 years earlier, drunk on youth and Puccini, the young conductor and his soprano had sworn together that if ever one betrayed their art, they would grant the other the death of a tragic heroine on the boards of La Scala. Isabella had chosen a different betrayal in mind: retirement, marriage, a quiet life. Bellincione had chosen to keep the oath literally, granting her Tosca's death in the only way his twisted love allowed. Poirot closed his eyes and heard, faint but unmistakable, the echo of that final applause rolling through the empty corridors like surf. Somewhere in the darkness above him a stage brace creaked, and for an instant he could have sworn he heard a woman's voice, Isabella's voice, singing the first phrase of Vici d'arte, before it dissolved into silence. He opened his eyes, adjusted his mustache with a tremor he would never admit, and walked toward the stage door where dawn was already beginning to stain the sky the color of old pearls. The score had lied, the ashes had spoken, and the little gray cells were now singing in perfect, terrible harmony. The conductor's baton would beat its last tonight. Chapter 5. The Understudy's Alibi. Poirot arrived at Lucia Moretti's modest dressing room on the 3rd floor just as the winter sun, thin and reluctant, slid a pale blade through the shutters and laid it across the girl's throat like a rehearsal for the knife she feared. She sat hunched on a cane chair, still wearing the camel hair coat, though the morning was already stifling with trapped radiator heat, and her eyes were so swollen that the famous Moretti beauty had retreated behind a mask of salt and sleeplessness. On the table before her lay the pearl earring she had brought to Poirot in the night, now cleaned of its accusing blood, together with a single white camellia whose petals had begun to bruised brown at the edges, exact twin to the flower crushed beneath Isabella's shoulder. Lucia stared at them as though they were loaded pistols. Poirot did not sit. He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a dancing master correcting an errant pupil. "Mademoiselle," he began in the tone of gentle implacability that had broken stronger souls than hers, "you have told the police that you spent the entire third act in the chorus wings, surrounded by 50 witnesses who would swear on the Madonna that you never moved. It is a formidable alibi. Yet the left sole of your evening slipper carries the imprint of a crushed camellia petal still moist with Isabella Valenti's blood, and the right glove, this one." He produced it from his pocket like a conjurer revealing a dove, bears a smear of Sangue di Tosca lipstick transferred from the rim of a champagne flute that was poured no earlier than 1040. "Explain to me, I beg you, how these souvenirs traveled from a locked dressing room to your person without your feet or fingers ever leaving the wings." Lucia's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The sound that emerged was half sob, half laugh. "I went to her," she whispered at last. "After the aria." Everyone was applauding. The stage was chaos. The chorus master had turned to take his own bow. Nobody was watching me. I only wanted to congratulate her, to touch the hem of genius one last time. The door was ajar. I slipped inside. She was already on the floor. The scarf was so tight I could not see how anyone could breathe. I thought she had fainted. I knelt. I touched her cheek. It was still warm. Then I saw the pearl earring lying beside her hand, and I picked it up without thinking. When I realized she was dead, I panicked. I ran. The camellia must have stuck to my shoe then. The lipstick, I do not know. Perhaps I brushed the table as I stood. Poirot listened without movement, only the faintest flicker beneath the waxed mustache betraying that the little gray cells were turning like clockwork. And the exact minute of this charitable visit? 10:55, perhaps 10:51. The clock in the corridor was striking the quarter as I fled. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Précisément. Yet Isabella Valenti was seen alive by her dresser, Gianni Rossi, at 10:42, removing her stage makeup and laughing at his threats. The stage manager's log records the final lighting cue at 10:47. Therefore, mademoiselle, you discovered the body at least 8 minutes after death occurred. You are innocent of the murder itself, but guilty of a silence that might have hanged you. Why did you not cry out at once? Lucia lifted her ravaged face. Because the first time Poirot saw the steel beneath the tears. Because the moment I stepped back into the corridor, I saw Maestro Bellancioni coming toward me, white as chalk, eyes wild, carrying the Tosca score pressed to his chest, like a shield. He looked at me, I looked at him, and in that second we both understood what the other had seen. He put a finger to his lips, just that, and walked on. I was terrified. If I spoke, he would say I had done it. Everyone knows I wanted her place. Everyone knows I hated waiting in her shadow. So I kept silent. May God forgive me. Poirot inclined his head, neither accusation nor absolution. And the emerald necklace found in your handbag? Planted, she said bitterly. I returned here to change. The bag was on the chair. When I opened it an hour later, the necklace fell out like a serpent. Someone wants me ruined as well as dead. Poirot picked up the bruised camellia, twirled it once between gloved fingers, and let it fall back to the table. Someone, yes. Someone who knew you would run to the body, who counted on your panic, who needed a scapegoat pretty enough to convince the police for a day or two. But the little gray cells, they dislike prettiness when it is purchased with clumsiness. The necklace is too obvious, the earring too convenient. Our murderer is an artist, mademoiselle. He composes in subtler keys. He moved to the door, paused. One last thing. When you knelt beside the body, did you notice whether the champagne glass the poisoned one had yet been touched? Lucia frowned, memory struggling through terror. It stood on the table untouched. The lipstick was on the other glass, the empty one. I remember thinking how strange, how calm everything looked, like a tableau. Poirot's smile was small, sharp, and entirely without warmth. Merci, you have been most illuminating. He descended the iron staircase slowly, rehearsing the new tempo in his head. Bellancioni had killed Isabella between 10:42 and 10:47, alone, swift, silent. Lucia had arrived at 10:51, seen the maestro leaving at 10:53, and fled. Someone else, a third person, had entered after Lucia, planted the necklace, and arranged the champagne glasses to suggest a failed poisoning followed by strangulation. The score was growing crowded. The orchestra was too large for perfect silence. Somewhere a wrong note had already sounded, and Poirot, ears attuned to the slightest dissonance, knew exactly which instrument had played it. At the bottom of the stairs he met Capitano De Luca, breathless, triumphant, holding aloft a small mother-of-pearl button. Found in the dressing room, torn from a man's dress shirt, monogrammed A.B. Arturo Bellancioni. We have him, signor. Poirot took the button, turned it over, and allowed himself the very smallest sigh. No, mon capitaine, he said gently. You have exactly what he wishes you to have. The button was torn deliberately, the monogram displayed like a banner. Our murderer grows reckless. Reckless men make mistakes, and mistakes, like arias, have their final, fatal cadence. He handed the button back, touched the brim of his hat in salute, and walked on toward the stage door where the pale Milanese morning waited, cold, clear, and hungry for truth. Chapter 6. The Blackmailer's Price. The fog that had lain over Milan all night thickened toward dawn, turning the narrow alleys behind La Scala into gray rivers where gas lamps floated like dying moons. And it was into this fog that Hercule Poirot stepped at 6 o'clock, coat collar high, cane tapping a deliberate rhythm on the wet cobblestones, following the scent of cheap pomade and mortal panic that led him to a crumbling pension above a closed trattoria in Via Agnello. The landlady, a widow with a mustache more impressive than Capitano De Luca's, needed no bribe. The mention of murder and a flash of Poirot's card sent her scurrying for the master key while muttering novenas. On the third floor, behind a door painted the sickly green of jealousy, Gianni Rossi was on his knees, stuffing lira notes and silk stockings into a cardboard valise, with the frantic haste of a man who believes the next train to Switzerland leaves in 5 minutes, and damn the timetable. Poirot entered without knocking, closed the door with the soft finality of a coffin lid, and regarded the dresser with the mild curiosity one might accord a cockroach discovered in the sugar bowl. Gianni froze, one hand still clutching a fistful of Isabella Valenti's monogrammed handkerchiefs, his brilliantined hair now hanging in greasy commas across his forehead. On the table lay the missing emerald necklace coiled like a glittering viper, together with a packet of letters tied in faded pink ribbon, and a railway ticket to Chiasso for 7:30 that morning. The room stank of fear, bay rum, and the particular sourness of a man who has not slept because every shadow wears the face of his victim. "Buongiorno, Signor Rossi," Poirot said pleasantly, removing his gloves one finger at a time. "You pack with admirable speed, yet I fear the frontier police have already been alerted. A pity. The Swiss are so dislike fugitives who travel with stolen jewelry and forged love letters." Gianni's mouth worked soundlessly. Then the words tumbled out in a torrent of Milanese dialect laced with terror. He had never meant harm, only justice. Isabella had promised him a villa in Como for his silence about the prince, then laughed when he reminded her, told him to take the emeralds instead and choke on them. He had come to her dressing room at 10:30 to plead, found her radiant from the aria, powdering her throat, humming the phrase "Non ho amato mai tanto la vita." She had turned on him with the scorn, called him a rat, a parasite, threatened to have him thrown into the orchestra pit. In rage, he had snatched the necklace from its velvet case, yes, and the letters from her drawer, letters he himself had written over months. Perfect forgeries in her hand describing nights of impossible passion. But he had intended only to ruin her if he could not profit, but when she laughed, again he had fled, alive. She was alive. He swore it on his mother's grave at 10:42 precisely because the corridor clock was striking the 3/4 as he ran. Poirot listened without movement, only the faintest tremor of his mustache betraying that every syllable was being weighed on the delicate scales of truth. When Gianni paused for breath, he stepped forward, picked up one of the letters, and held it to the bare electric bulb. The paper was new, the ink fresh, the flourish of the capital. A slightly heavier than Isabella's genuine hand, the unconscious emphasis of a forger who loves his own creation too much. "Admirable work," Poirot murmured. "Yet the watermark is 1935, whereas the prince in question has been confined to a sanatorium in Davos since 1933. A detail, perhaps, but the little gray cells adore details the way cats adore cream." Johnny collapsed onto the bed, valise forgotten, and began to weep with the abandon of a child caught stealing jam. Between sobs, he spilled the rest. He had returned to the theater at midnight, drunk on grappa and self-pity, hoping to retrieve the necklace before the police search. Instead, he had found the dressing-room door sealed, policemen everywhere, and in blind panic had slipped the emeralds into Lucia Moretti's handbag while she sat weeping in the green room. She would be blamed. She deserved it. She had everything he wanted. He had not killed Isabella. He was a thief, a worm, but not a murderer. Per l'amor di Dio, have mercy. Poirot regarded him for a long moment, then took the necklace, letting the stones run through his gloved fingers like cold green blood. "You are indeed a worm, Signor Rossi," he said at last, "but worms do not strangle nightingales. You left Madame Valenti alive and laughing at 10:42. The clock in her dressing room stopped, you will recall, by the violence of the attack reads 10:51. 9 minutes. In 9 minutes, the nightingale was silenced forever. You may keep your worthless life, but the Swiss train, I regret, has already departed without you." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One last curiosity. When you fled at 10:42, did you pass anyone in the corridor?" Johnny wiped his nose on a silk stocking. "Only the maestro. Coming the other way, carrying his baton like a sword. He did not see me. He was singing under his breath. Visidate. Softly, like a lullaby." Poirot inclined his head, the smallest possible bow. "Merci. You have been, in your squalid fashion, most instructive." Downstairs, the widow was waiting with rosary and indignation. Poirot soothed her with a 50-lire note and the assurance that the questura would remove her troublesome tenant within the hour. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the first pale gold of true sunrise over the rooftops, and somewhere a church bell tolled 7 slow strokes for the soul of a woman who would never again answer a curtain call. Poirot walked back toward La Scala, the emerald necklace heavy in his pocket, the stopped clock ticking in his mind. 10:42. Gianni flees. 10:47, the final lighting cue. 10:51, the scarf drawn tight. 10:53, Lucia discovers the body. 10:55, the maestro seen walking away, singing the very aria he had just murdered to. The tempo was perfect, the orchestration almost flawless, yet one instrument had played fractionally ahead of the beat, and Poirot, ears attuned to the heartbeat of crime, now knew exactly which one. At the stage door he paused, looked up at the great facade still draped in black for a performance that would never resume, and addressed the silent building in a whisper only the stones could hear. "You kept your oath after all, madam. but not the one you intended, yet an oath nonetheless. Requiescat in pace. Then he entered the theater for the last time, ready to conduct the final terrible crescendo. Chapter 7. The Oath Revealed. The auditorium of La Scala had never seemed so vast as it did at 10:30 that same morning, when the house lights were raised only enough to keep the shadows from swallowing the stage entirely, and the great chandelier hung above like a frozen explosion of grief. Every seat was empty except the royal box, where Hercule Poirot stood alone in faultless black, gloves immaculate, cane resting across the velvet rail, surveying the small group he had summoned beneath the ghostlight as though they were the final unwilling cast of a tragedy written 20 years earlier. Conte Riccardo, hollow-eyed and trembling. Maestro Arturo Bellincioni, deathly pale yet still clutching his ivory baton as if it could conduct him out of hell. Lucia Moretti, wrapped in black lace like a young widow. Gianni Rossi, flanked by 2 silent carabinieri. And Capitano De Luca, notebook open, mustache bristling with anticipation. The air smelled of dust, extinguished footlights, and the particular chill that settles into a theater when no music has been played for too many hours. Poirot did not raise his voice. He allowed the perfect acoustics of the empty house to do it for him, so that every word floated upward into the gilded gods and drifted back again like an accusing echo. 20 years ago, he began, in this very theater, a young soprano named Isabella Valenti and an even younger assistant conductor named Arturo Bellincioni stood upon this stage after a student performance of Tosca and swore an oath, half jest, half sacred vow, upon the blood-stained score. Should ever one of us betray our art or our love, let the other grant a death worthy of the opera we serve here beneath these lights during the final notes of Vici d'arte. They were 25, drunk on Puccini and Barolo, and they kissed to seal it, and for 2 decades they believed the promise had dissolved into laughter. But oaths, mesdames et messieurs, have a way of waiting. He stepped down from the box, descending the side stairs with the measured tread of a priest approaching the altar, until he stood center stage beneath the ghost light, the exact spot where Isabella had sung her last perfect phrase. Last night, Madame Valenti intended to announce her retirement after this final Tosca. She would marry Conte Riccardo, save him from ruin, and leave the stage forever. For her it was an act of love. For Maestro Bellincioni it was betrayal of the only deity he had ever truly worshipped, art itself. The oath, dormant for 20 years, woke in him like a beast. Bellincioni made a sound, half sob, half snarl, but did not move. Poirot continued, voice soft, relentless. At 10:42, Gianni Rossi fled the dressing room, having stolen the emeralds but leaving Isabella alive, radiant, humming. At 10:47, the final lighting cue fell. During those 5 minutes, while 10,000 people applauded in delirium, Maestro Bellincioni slipped through the pass door no one watches during an ovation. He found Isabella at her mirror, loosening the crimson scarf after the staged strangling of Scarpia, the same scarf she had worn every Tosca for 15 years, embroidered with Napoleon's bees because she believed they brought luck. He offered the toast with the poisoned champagne intended originally for the Conte, a diversion, a flourish. She refused the glass. She had drunk enough triumph already. He stepped behind her, whispered perhaps the first line of their old oath, and drew the scarf tight with the same hands that had shaped her voice since she was 17. 1 minute, no more. She had no time to struggle. The audience above covered every sound. When the applause peaked, he laid her down gently, almost tenderly, placed the score beneath her hand, and walked out singing the aria she would never finish. Lucia Moretti gave a low cry. The Conte turned his face away. Gianni Rossi began to shake. Bellincioni alone stood motionless, baton still in his grip, eyes fixed on a point far beyond the back wall. Poirot moved closer until the ghost light carved both their faces in stark white and black. You wrote the false suicide note in pencil to mimic a left-handed despair you thought no one would question. You tore out the final page so that her death would mirror Tosca's leap. You planted the emerald necklace in Lucia's bag and the pearl earring in her room so that suspicion would dance elsewhere while you conducted the mourning. You left your monogrammed button and your varnish and your rosin like a signature no artist can resist appending to his masterpiece. But you forgot one thing, mon ami. Hercule Poirot also serves art, the art of truth, and he does not permit even genius to murder in its name. For a long moment the only sound was the faint creak of the great curtain rings high overhead, as though the building itself were breathing. Then Bellincioni laughed a terrible cracked sound that belonged more to Scarpia than to any man. She wished to die as Tosca, he said, voice hoarse from unshed tears. I merely arranged the staging. She was never more beautiful than when the lights caught the scarf and the bees seemed alive against her throat. The audience applauded her death as they had applauded her life. I kept our oath. He raised the baton slowly as if about to cue an invisible orchestra, then with a sudden savage movement drove the sharp ferrule into his own throat just below the ear. Blood, bright arterial scarlet, arced across the ghost light and footlights alike. Lucia screamed, De Luca lunged, the baton clattered to the boards. Bellincioni folded to his knees with the grace of a lifetime spent bowing to applause, smiled once a smile of perfect peace, and toppled sideways across the chalk mark where Isabella had sung her final note of transcendence only 12 hours earlier. Poirot did not move. He watched the blood pool beneath the ghost light until it touched the toe of his perfectly polished shoe, then looked up into the vast darkness above. The oath is kept, he said quietly, to the empty seats, to the listening gods, to the woman who would never again take a bow. May you both find a kinder libretto in whatever theater waits beyond the final curtain. He turned, walked upstage past the fallen conductor and disappeared into the wings without looking back, leaving the living to their sirens and their statements and their long, useless remorse, while the great chandelier flickered once, as though 1,000 crystal tears had decided, after all, to fall. Chapter 8. The Little Gray Cells. Sing silence fell after the shot the way a great velvet curtain falls at the end of a tragedy. Sudden, heavy, absolute. Bellincioni lay on his side beneath the ghost light, one arm flung out exactly as Isabella's had been, the ivory baton a few inches from his slack fingers, blood spreading in a slow dark lake that reflected in the polished stage until the boards looked like a black mirror held up to the heavens. Capitano De Luca knelt, pressing a handkerchief to the wound that no longer needed pressing, shouting useless orders in Italian too rapid for grief. The two carabinieri stood frozen, rifles half raised, as though the enemy had been a ghost that had already vanished. Lucia Moretti had sunk to the floor, black lace pooling around her like spilled ink, both hands over her mouth to keep the screams inside. Only Conte Riccardo remained upright, staring at the body with the blank expression of a man who has just watched his last hope bleed out across a stage. Poirot alone seemed untouched by the chaos. He stepped forward, bent with the neatness of a man retrieving a dropped glove, and picked up the fallen baton. A single drop of blood slid along the ivory and fell from the tip with a soft, distinct plop into the widening pool. He held the baton horizontally, conductor to conductor, and addressed the dead man in a voice so low only the stage itself could hear. You composed your finale with passion, mon ami, but you forgot that every score must be read to the end. The audience is never satisfied with a corpse alone. It demands explanation. He turned, then raised his voice, clear, calm, almost conversational. yet it carried to the uppermost gallery as though the house were full. Permit me, mesdames et messieurs, to conduct the final bars so that no one leaves this theater with a single unresolved chord. He turned first to De Luca, who looked down at the captain's blood-soaked handkerchief. The champagne, Capitano, was poisoned with enough cyanide to kill 20 sopranos, yet the glass bearing Isabella's lipstick was only half drunk. And the poison had scarcely begun its work when the scarf ended everything. Why waste such excellent venom? Because it was never meant for her. It was meant for Conte Riccardo, who was expected, indeed invited, to visit the dressing room immediately after the aria to receive her answer to his proposal. The murderer substituted the bottle, forged the card with the single initial R, and waited. When the Conte delayed lingering in the foyer to accept congratulations on his impending engagement, the plan shifted. Poison became merely a red herring, a discord to confuse the ear. He moved to Lucia Moretti, helped her gently to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. You, mademoiselle, were to be the perfect scapegoat. The necklace planted in your bag, the pearl earring beneath your chair, the camellia crushed on your shoe, all arranged while you wept in the green room. The murderer knew your adoration bordered on obsession. He counted on your running to the body, touching it, fleeing in panic. A jealous understudy, a stolen triumph. The public would devour the story like sugar. Lucia shuddered but did not speak. Poirot released her and walked to Gianni Rossi, who had gone the color of tallow. You, Petit Vert, provided the interval of chaos the murderer needed. Your blackmail attempt at 10:42 forced Isabella to remain at her mirror longer than she intended, removing makeup, laughing at you, keeping her back turned to the door. Your flight left the corridor momentarily empty. 9 minutes from 10:42 to 10:51 was all the maestro required. Finally, he stood over Bellincioni's body, looking down with neither triumph nor disgust, only the weary recognition. And you, maestro, you could not bear that the voice you had shaped, the instrument you believed you owned, would fall silent forever for the sake of a bankrupt aristocrat and a quiet life. So you granted her the only death you thought worthy. Tosca's death, on the boards of La Scala, during the echo of her greatest aria. You used the scarf already loosened for the staged strangling. You placed the score beneath her hand. You wrote the false confession in pencil to mimic despair. You tore out the final page so that her suicide leap would seem complete. You left your cord, varnish, your rosin, your monogrammed buttons, signatures too proud to resist. And when the little Belgian began to hear the true melody beneath your discords, you chose your own final curtain rather than face a court that would never understand the purity of your motive. He laid the bloodied baton across Bellincioni's chest like a knight's sword upon a bier. The oath you swore together in 1916 was romantic nonsense, yes, but you kept it with the literal madness of an artist who believes art is greater than life. Isabella had outgrown the oath. She wished to live. You could not permit that. So you killed the woman to preserve the diva, and then you killed yourself to join her in the only eternity you recognize, the endless applause of memory. Poirot stepped back. The ghost light flickered once, as though acknowledging the final cadence. Capitano De Luca rose slowly, closing his notebook with a snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. "It is finished, then," he said, voice rough. Poirot looked up into the darkness where the great curtain hung motionless, heavy with 20 years of triumphs and now one terrible crime. "No, mon capitaine," he replied softly. "It is only the interval. The house lights come up, the audience leaves, the stage is swept, and tomorrow another company will sing another drama. But the boards remember. They always remember." He placed his hat upon his head, adjusted it to the precise angle that had become legend, and walked upstage toward the past door through which Bellancioni had come to murder and to die. At the threshold he paused, turned once more to the silent figures beneath the ghost light. One last request. Leave the bodies where they lie until sunset. Let them share the stage one final time as they always wished. After that, close the theater for a week. Some scores need silence before the next performance can begin again. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing away into the labyrinth of corridors, leaving only the smell of blood and the faint lingering perfume of white camellias and tragedy. Somewhere high in the flies, a rope creaked. The curtain rings stirred though no wind touched them, and for an instant those who remained, it seemed they could hear very faintly two voices, one silver, one broken, singing the same phrase of Vici d'arte in perfect heartbreaking unison before fading into the dust and darkness that belong to every theater when the living have finally gone home. Chapter 9. Curtain. The bodies were carried out at dusk, Bellancioni first, wrapped in a black stage cloth so that only the ivory baton protruded like a tragic prop. Then Isabella, still wearing the crimson scarf with its golden bees because the medical examiner declared it must remain in place until the autopsy. The two stretchers passed each other in the narrow corridor behind the proscenium, almost touching, and the porters swore later that the woman's dead hand seemed to reach for the man's sleeve before the bearers pulled them apart. Outside, the fog had returned thicker than ever, swallowing the piazza, turning the arc lamps into bruised halos, and the small crowd that had waited all day, journalists, flower sellers, old women who had heard every great soprano since Patti fell silent as the hearses rolled past, black swans gliding into the Milanese night. No one applauded, no one dared. Poirot watched from the stage door, half hidden in shadow, coat collar high against a cold that came more from within than without. When the second hearse disappeared, he stepped back inside, closed the heavy iron door with his own hands, and turned the great key that had not been used since the war. The click echoed through the empty building like the closing of a tomb. He did not leave immediately. Instead, he walked once more onto the stage, now stripped of bodies and blood, scrubbed clean by silent charwomen who had wept as they worked, until only a faint, darker patch beneath the ghost light remained, a stain no mop could ever quite erase. He stood upon that stain and looked out into the auditorium. Every seat was empty, yet he felt the presence of 10,000 invisible spectators who had watched the entire tragedy unfold. The lover's oath in 1916, the triumph of last night, the murder, the suicide, the revelation. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heart beating, steady, unhurried. The metronome of a man who has solved too many deaths to be surprised by any single one. He removed his hat and placed it over his heart. "Madame," he said softly to the darkness, "you wish to live for love at last. He could not allow it. Forgive him if you can. He believed he was saving you from mediocrity. Artists are cruel gods." A faint draft stirred the great curtain, making the heavy velvet breathe like a sleeping animal. Somewhere high above, a stage weight shifted with a soft thud, and for an instant Poirot thought he heard the ghost of a high B-flat, pure, effortless, heartbreaking, hanging in the air the way Isabella's voice had hung last night before the scarf silenced it forever. He did not move, did not breathe, waiting for the next phrase, but there was only silence again, deeper than before. He bowed, a full formal bow such as a conductor gives the soloist after the final cadence, then turned and walked upstage. At the past door he paused, took from his pocket the single white camellia he had carried all day, the last perfect bloom from the bouquet crushed beneath her body, and laid it gently on the chalk mark where her head had rested. The flower looked impossibly bright against the dark boards, a small defiant star. "Addio, mia cara," he whispered. "You sang your life as though every note were the last. In that, at least, you were granted your wish." He left then, walking the long corridor past dressing rooms already stripped of flowers and telegrams, past the conductor's podium where the bloodied baton had been retrieved and bagged as evidence, past the green room fireplace whose ashes still held the curled fragment of the destroyed page. At the stage door he paused once more, listening. The building was settling into its nocturnal vigil, ropes creaking, dust sifting, memories rearranging themselves like scenery for tomorrow's performance. Somewhere water dripped with the slow regularity of a contrite heart. Outside, the fog had swallowed Milan entirely. Poirot emerged into it, turned up his collar, and began to walk toward the piazza without looking back. Behind him, the great doors of La Scala closed of their own weight, and the locks engaged with a finality that sounded to those few late passers-by who heard it, like the drawing of a mighty breath held for 20 years and now released. Inside, the ghost light continued to burn alone on the empty stage, its pale flame trembling over the single white camellia, keeping its small, faithful watch while the theater slept. And if, in the hush between midnight and the first pale rumor of dawn, a woman's voice was heard once more rehearsing the phrase, "Vici d'arte, vici d'amore," with a tenderness no living throat could match, the night watchman Benedetto, dozing in his chair by the stage door, simply crossed himself, pulled his cap lower, and pretended he had heard nothing at all. La Scala has always kept its own counsel, and some encores are granted only to the dead. Chapter 10. Encore, Hercule Poirot did not take the morning train to Paris. Instead, he walked at first light through the still sleeping city, past the Duomo where pigeons wheeled like gray notes above the marble facade, past the silent Galleria where the glass roof held the fog prisoner in long pale bars, until he reached the Brera and the small cafe that opens earliest for the street sweepers and the priests. He ordered a café corretto, no milk, no sugar, and sat at the single table outside beneath the still bare plane trees, watching the city stir as though it had not spent the night bleeding from an open wound in its proudest heart. The waiter, recognizing the famous mustache from the newspapers, brought the coffee without being asked a second time and left the little Belgian in peace. He drank slowly, letting the grappa burn away the taste of blood and camellias that lingered at the back of his throat. When the cup was empty, he placed it precisely in its saucer, laid a 100-lire note beneath the spoon, far too much, but grief has its own arithmetic, and walked on. Milan was waking. Shutters clanged upward, trams clattered, women in black hurried to early mass, carrying the day's bread like pale loaves of sorrow. No one looked at him twice. The city had already turned the page, and the headlines now screamed of the conductor's suicide and the diva's tragic passion, as though the entire story had been written by Puccini himself and needed no further commentary from a mere detective. At the entrance to La Scala, the black mourning drape still hung, but a new poster had been pasted crookedly over the announcements of Tosca, Teatro chiuso per lutto. Beneath it, someone, a stagehand perhaps, or a chorister who could not bear silence, had pinned a single white camellia and a photograph of Isabella taken 20 years earlier. Laughing in the sunlight of her first triumph, eyes brilliant with the future that had just ended in a crimson scarf. A small crowd stood in silent homage, old subscribers, students, a flower seller weeping openly into her apron. Poirot paused at the edge, half hidden by the shadow of a column, and watched them lay their roses and their tears at the locked doors. A boy of perhaps 12, all knees and earnest eyes, was trying to pin a handwritten note to the board. Poirot stepped forward and without a word lifted the child so the paper could be fastened higher. The note read, in careful schoolboy script, "Grazie, signora, per la voce che ci ha fatto sognare." Poirot set the boy down gently, patted his cheek once, and moved on before gratitude could become awkward. He walked the long way around to the stage door, nodding to Benedetto dozing in his porter's lodge. The old Sicilian woke with a start, crossed himself, and fumbled for the key. "Signor Poirot, you wish to go inside again?" "Only for a moment, amico. One last courtesy." Inside, the corridors were colder than before, as though the building had drawn grief around itself like a shawl. The ghost light still burned center stage. The camellia he had left lay untouched, but now it was surrounded by others, dozens, hundreds. A snowdrift of white against the dark boards, some fresh, some already browning at the edges, left by those who had slipped past the locks in the night, because theaters, like cathedrals, belong ultimately to the faithful rather than the custodians. The flowers had been arranged in the shape of a perfect high C clef, the stem of the central bloom pointing exactly to the spot where Isabella's head had rested. Poirot stood at the edge of this silent offering and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with age or the Milanese damp. He removed his hat. "You have your encore after all, madame," he said to the listening dark. "Not the applause of 10,000, perhaps, but the homage of those who truly understood what you gave them. It is sufficient." From the flies high above came the faintest sigh, a rope settling, a canvas flat breathing, or perhaps something else. Poirot waited motionless until the silence returned, deeper now, accepting. Then he placed his hat back on his head, turned, and walked toward the past door for the final time. At the threshold he paused. Somewhere in the vast spaces above the grid, a woman's voice. Isabella's voice, unmistakable, warm, effortless, began the first phrase of Vici d'arte, not loud, barely more than a breath, yet it filled the entire house as though every seat were occupied and every heart beating in perfect unison. Poirot did not turn around. He simply closed his eyes, allowed the notes to wash over him like absolution, and when the phrase ended on that suspended, heartbreaking pianissimo he had heard her sing 1,000 times in memory. He bowed once deeply from the waist, the bow of a colleague to a colleague, of one artist to another who has just delivered a performance beyond mortality. Then the voice was gone, leaving only the faint perfume of camellias and the sense of a stage door closing softly somewhere in the dark. Poirot straightened, adjusted his mustache with the old familiar gesture, and stepped out into the corridor. Behind him, the ghost light flickered once, twice, then burned steady again, keeping its ancient promise to the empty house. He did not lock the stage door after himself. There was no need. Some doors, once the final note has sounded, remain open forever. Outside, the city was fully awake now, noisy, indifferent, alive. Poirot walked toward the station through streets already forgetting, coat flapping in the sharp wind that had come to sweep away the fog. At the corner of Via Manzoni, he paused beneath the awning of a tobacconist, bought a packet of cigarettes he would never smoke, and stood a moment watching the trams and the hurrying crowds. Somewhere a church bell began to toll the hour, clear, bronze, unhurried. He lit a cigarette after all, drew one lungful, and exhaled slowly into the bright, cold air. "Addio, Milano," he murmured. "You keep your secrets well." Then he dropped the cigarette, crushed it beneath his shining shoe, and walked on toward the train that would carry him south to the sun and the sea and the next impossible case, humming under his breath, perfectly in tune and without the slightest effort, the phrase that would follow him all the way to Naples. Vici d'arte, vici d'amore. And behind him, 500 kilometers away, the ghost light of La Scala kept burning, and the white camellias kept watch. And the greatest soprano of her generation took the encore she had earned night after night for anyone with ears still pure enough to hear.